Hey yo, what's up, y'all? Hope everyone's doing well for this on this Sunday, fun day, because it's fun or something. Um, gonna do a little video on Boondocks and All in the Family. Two shows that you wouldn't normally connect, probably, but um, I think they make sense when you kind of realize what each is trying to accomplish in their own eras. Um, you guys kind of touched on that idea. All in the Family, I mentioned it in the little intro, right? All in the Family coming out of the civil rights movement. Like I think it premiered in 1970 or 71, so like early 70s. The episode you watched was from like 73 or something. So this was like fresh off of the the civil rights movement. So there was this feeling in our country about like, how is this going to work? Like, I talked in my last video about you can't just snap your fingers and say, okay, now sexism is gone. Okay, now racism is gone. Like, there was this big looming question, like, how is this going to work? And Norman Lear, in those shows that I listed that he created, were really invested in, I think, figuring out this was going to work with characters like Archie Bunker. Like, how do you combat that, right? And then Boondocks is sort of this post civil rights, after all the success and sort of joy and optimism of the civil rights movement. We kind of settled back into this better but not perfect union, I guess. And if you look at the Boondocks, it's sort of a throwback to All in the Family in that it's saying, "Hey, that was great. Like we did make a lot of progress, but we didn't make all the progress. Like we're not done here." Um, so I think they both present really interesting and um, I guess time specific, right? They're little snapshots of where we were or are as a country. Um, so I'll start with Boondocks. So that and I don't know if I mentioned this about pilot episodes. We watch a lot of pilot episodes, mostly because that historically is the episode that's closest to the pure idea of what the show is wants to be before you tap into all the sort of superfluous and non-artistic influences. In other words, producers and advertisers and focus groups and all these people, these kinds of entities have yet to sort of dismantle the show and make it shitty in many cases or make it popular, right? Popularity is often confused with quality. And it's almost never the case that the most popular thing is the highest quality thing. Um, so pilot episodes are the closest thing to the pure idea of what the show wants to be before, as you know, any show you've watched, it starts to deteriorate at some point. And that's typically because it's getting further away from the true nature of the show or the idea. So the Boondocks is, I think, as important a racial commentary as any in our culture. If you really look at it, it's right up there with like The Simpsons and South Park and um, stuff like that, or anything more serious. Um, and it's because it gives you this really sort of layered look at it, right? The way it's set up, you have Robert, who is sort of this, he's kind of a Cliff Huxtable type character in that he sort of he makes his black family white, right? They literally move to this suburb with this inheritance, and he wants a better life for his kids, and the kids don't really understand it because they're torn between, the sentiment that that's being a sellout, right? If you're not connected to your culture in a very specific way. But it's obviously nice to have this house and live in this safe environment, whatever it is. Um, so, and he is a holdover from the actual civil rights movement. So he, who, can't remember who was writing about it in their comments, but the hoses, dogs and fire hoses, that whole scene about Robert saying like, I fought right next to Dr. King. So there's a lot of interracial stuff that's going on there. And then of course you have Huey and Riley, who represent these opposite poles of black youth culture, right? Um, Huey is the activist. He's the critical thinker. He's looking for justice. He's looking for equality, like all those kinds of things. Um, and Riley is the opposite. He's he's the gangster, right? He's into like being a thug, guns, and um, the certain he looks a certain way, he talks a certain way. That's to represent that ideal, right? There's a whole story arc about the R. Kelly. He's pro R. Kelly basically, um, and he's just obsessed with that, like rappers and things like that. So, and it's exaggerated to the point where you're supposed to be looking at it that way. You have so those three characters obviously have some interesting dynamics, and then you have Ruckus, who um, a couple of you mentioned Ruckus like as this uh, what was the term, internalized internalized racism basically. um, Alyssa mentioned that. I think Charlie mentioned that, like his internalized racism, like and I think they use him that way in the show. Like he is racism, right? Just he is a metaphor for racism. He's everywhere. Like he's literally everywhere. Like wherever they go, he kind of just shows up out of out of nowhere, um, or seems like he's been there forever. And he's always in these menial, sort of like really low grade jobs, right? He's a janitor. He's working as a waiter or whatever he was at the party. He's always in that role, and he's just sort of ubiquitous that way. He's ugly. Um, he's ignorant. Like these are all. I think he is living racism, basically, um, and that internalization of racism, and what that can, like, how that can really fuck with you. Um, so, and then there's other obviously, but those are the main players in this. They add a lot of characters as the series goes on. There's actually a guy who lives in the neighborhood who's named Tom. Like he's literally an Uncle Tom, a metaphor for Uncle Tom's. Right? He's completely sold out. He's married this white woman. He's very light skinned. He's like a lawyer, um, and he has a white voice, and his name is Tom. And they use him right, as a sort of device for those kinds of things. So the show is obviously like put together like strategically to make these kind of points about um, everything that you guys were bringing up in your comments. This is like '05 the show starts. I think it ran for like 4 years, maybe more seasons than that. So mid to late 2000s. But it's just I feel like it should be required viewing for anybody. Um, Huey's named after Huey P. Newton, who was obviously one of the founders of the Black Panther um, movement. Um, Freeman, Riley, and Huey, like their names just in general, are all sort of alluding to the Black Power advancement. They're named crucial names in. Um, so again, these are not even like Easter eggs. Um, so there's the cultural clash, right, of this black family moving into this white neighborhood, the generational clash between, in this episode, Onceler, the white guy who Mr. Own Everything, as Robert calls him, and Robert, like they're the same generation. And then and Huey and Riley and the Onceler's kid, right, who got shot out the window, that kid. Like, so there is this generational sort of um, clash that they're kind of trying to sift through too. Um, a bunch of you mentioned, so Tiffany mentioned this, um, and Alyssa mentioned it, and even Mallory, like this idea of, saying all the right things but meaning none of them. So all these rich white people, like I liked how Mallory put it, right? They're looking for this, look, I'm not racist, right? Like, give me a medal, like, reward me for that. Um, I want a pat on the back. But this, just like trying not to be racist almost makes you racist, if that makes any sense. Um, and you see it the way they infantilize Huey specifically. Um, and they're like, "Oh, you're just so articulate, right? And you're so cute and that kind of thing. You're so intelligent, right? Like, which is so condescending and it's basically coded racism. Um, but this was a big thing. I think the show is pointing at in the '80s. Big thing was to infantilize African American youth and sort of. I mean, the two of the biggest shows in the '80s were Webster with Emmanuel Lewis, who was a literal, like, I don't know if he was a dwarf, but he was this tiny little. I don't know what the. He was this little kid, black kid, adopted by this wealthy sort of white couple, um, and totally infantilized. And Gary Coleman played Arnold on Different Strokes, same idea. He and his brother were adopted by this. So the white savior thing is there. There's this infantilization of African American youth on TV. They're so cute and lovable, like almost like pets, which is not a good look. So I think he uses in this episode specifically, he uses Huey to make that statement, right? Um, and Huey doesn't want any part. He's pissed about it. He's like, stop doing that, right? But there's bigger implications to that whole thing. I think one of the, I mentioned this in this idea that we're not done yet, right? We're not done, and Tiffany kind of mentioned this um, about the the idea that we haven't come all the way to equality, racial equality, and that's what the whole opening scene is meant to be. So if you remember, the opening scene is literally Huey's having a dream about he's at this garden party and he's saying all these things, and what he's saying has import, right? What he's saying is causing these people to lose their minds and freak out because it's that sort of like bold and in your face, and they they actually care about what he's saying, right? There's a guy on fire, everyone starts fighting, it just starts this riot. Like that's his dream. Like his dream is that a black man's words would incite this kind of fervor in white America and make them a wake up call kind of thing. And then literally, I mean, he lives out his dream and the exact opposite happens. So the exact opposite. Like same conversation, same things happen. He says the same things and they just clap and they nod and they, you're so articulate, all those kinds of things, and he's just completely dismissed. And in a very like low key racist way, right? Like that's what you guys were all talking about. The subtle racism, the courteous apathy. Charlie used the term courteous apathy, the performance based acceptance, which is what Tiffany was saying, and Shay said a very similar thing to that, which goes back to my saying all the right things and meaning none of them, right? So Huey is used in this episode and on most episodes to be like, no, you've all been duped, right? We like in the way I look at it is civil rights movement was a great victory, but it was also the power, the those in power giving concessions basically to women and minorities, basically saying, okay, fine, here, have your Civil Rights Act, but we're gonna still do this covertly and kind of, I'm gonna try to settle back into something that's still not even close to equal. So every movement kind of goes through this cycle. Like you really fight for something and you win it and you feel like, yes, we won it. Then you get complacent and another movement sprouts up, right? So we've gone through women, we've gone through African Americans and Latinos and a sort of a racial movement. We've gone through homosexuals fighting for these rights and equality. Now there's a trans movement. So there's all these, and every one, eventually, the power class is just like, okay, fine, here, you can get married, and then like, yay, we can get married, and then you kind of, they're throwing you candy basically, like, here, take this and go away. Like, we gave you your candy. And this show is Boondocks is saying like, no, like don't take the candy, right? Like we need more than candy. We need the whole meal, right? And that's what I think is the best part about the Boondocks is that seems to be at the core of most episodes. It's just like, no, guys, you're being distracted and sort of misled. Like, stay the course. And Huey's that. Huey's the stay the course kind of character. Like, we're not done, right? Another big pivotal scene in this episode is when Onceler comes to the house to basically interrogate Robert about, who he is. And I think it's interesting because if you remember, he sits him down. He's like, okay, so you're not gay, right? You're not Muslim. You're not a terrorist, like those kinds of things. It has no problem with his blackness. Like this is another sort of hint at Huey's fear, which is like Black America is not feared anymore. Not in a devious way, but what they say doesn't matter anymore. There's no import. with that the power class, as I mentioned before, has moved on to other threats, quote unquote. And in '05, right, that was the feeling, was like that Huey represents, and that Onceler is sort of confirming, like, we've dealt with the black community. Now the threat is the gay community and the Muslim community, because that's all he asks him about. He's like, doesn't care that he's black. That's a huge statement to make. He should care, not because he's like, oh, a stereotype thing, but a equality thing. Gay slash Muslim is the new black, right? He's not concerned about black people at all. They've been dealt with. Civil Rights Act dealt with that problem. This is not me talking. This is what the show is saying about the black community. And he's literally like, he's leaving. He's like, I like you, Robert. You're old school, which means what? What does that mean? Like, I think it means you're old school. Like, you know your place. Like, you're one of the good black guys. You're not gonna make waves. You're not gonna say, you know, Ronald Reagan is the devil. Like, those kinds of things. You're old school. You know how this works, right? I'm white. I have all the money. I have all the power. I'm just letting you live here, like that kind of thing. Which is, again, not good. Like, those are those little, like, those subtle sort of digs, racist digs, that this episode really sort of throws at you pretty quickly. Yeah, I didn't mention that. So then you have Onceler's kid, right? Who was in Iraq, and they sent him home, and I'm rich, bitch, right? That's Charlie Murphy's voice, Eddie Murphy's brother. But this whole idea of white privilege, he wishes he was black, obviously. But that idea of white privilege, and the tagline on the end of the episode is like, the kid's in 30 years he'll be president of the United States and he'll still be a fucking idiot, or whatever he says. Like, and he wears this huge W chain. Like, what is that? That's not even a veiled metaphor. He's basically a George W. Bush metaphor, right? Entitlement and power and money and no experience or no qualifications. That kid's going to be president. Why? Just because who he is, right? He's going to end up such a George W. Bush sort of dig. And Huey even says, like, these people aren't worried about us. Like, that's a key line in the whole episode. And if you look at the theme song, listen to the theme song. Theme songs are important. I mentioned the iCarly one. I will remain a soldier until the war is won is a line from the theme song. So, like, that's what this first episode is about. Like, the war is, we won a couple battles, but we have not won the war. Like, and that's kind of where that show is headed, as you can see. So now we move to All in the Family, which I grew up watching, and it's hard to explain, like, how huge a show it was. Like, you guys just don't understand. Like, there were 3 networks, like, so everybody watched it. You couldn't catch it later. You couldn't just watch it whenever you wanted, right? Like, I think more people watched All in the Family weekly, like on a random weekday episode, than like the finale of Game of Thrones or whatever. Like, it averaged like 64 million viewers, which is, I mean, it's insane if you look at ratings. So So it was in every household. So it's like the reach of of shows was way broader than it is now, right? Because everything's so niche now. Um, I think this is Norman Lear's Crown Jewel. Yeah, this episode was from 1973. Um, and it deals with more than just race. I just picked a race themed episode, um, and kind of went into it. Bella mentioned this, like it was a clear departure from the. She used the word sanitized, which is a good one. But just like the sanitized version of the American family in the 40s, 50s, 60s, right? Um, Complete departure. And I think that's that was a more realistic look at um, how families sort of were. Back to my original question, like how is this going to work, you know? And they give you the culture or the generational clash, right? So you have Gloria, who is Archie and Edith's daughter, and her boyfriend, fiance, husband, meathead, or um, Mike. They're obviously this younger generation. They're the generation behind the civil rights movement. They are progressives. They're liberals. They're having, this is the battleground, right? This is the fight that these generations were going through to get the Civil Rights Act passed. So there's obviously that at every turn. Um, Another opening credits theme song connection. Like, if you didn't notice that the Family Guy theme song and intro is a direct parody of this, you're really not paying attention. Like, but if you listen to the lyrics of that song, you hear what this show is supposed to be about, right? It's Archie and Edith singing, and it's basically, guys like us, we had it made. Who's guys like us? It's basically MAGA before MAGA, right? They're saying, like, let's go back to the days before women had a say and gay people were considered equals and black people had rights. Like, let's go back to, guys like us, we had it made. Of course you did. You were white men for the most part. Those were the days, right? And you knew who you were then. Girls were girls and men were men. Everybody pulled his weight, didn't need no welfare state. So the whole song is basically this lamentation about where the current state of the country. And so basically, like Archie singing, like, why can't it be like it used to be when, you know, mediocrity was like mediocrity held sway. Um, but it's really, I think, interesting, if not inspiring, to know that like a show like this was built from the ground up to be this cultural touchstone, this, and to criticize the culture and to help maybe guide it through these and answer some of these more difficult questions. Um, so basically, how is this going to work? How's this going to work with the Archie Bunkers of the world? Now, I think Tyler said he was stunned by Archie Bunker. Makes total sense. Like, you don't see much of him any. Well, I guess you're seeing more of him now with Trump's sort of rise. But at the time, like, he was this wildly popular character because so many people saw themselves, like my dad was Archie Bunker, and I know a bunch of my buddies from like college and high school, like that was their dad, right? So there's a TV has this power to either normalize or radicalize behaviors. Okay? So it depends on how critically you're looking at the TV. And most people don't look at it critically. So when they watch something, it tends to normalize their behaviors. So someone like my dad watching All in the Family, like seeing Archie be this racist bigot asshole, like, yeah, see, that's, yeah, go Archie, like, applause, like, normalizes his own um, shittiness, basically. But anybody who's watching it critically will very quickly realize you're not supposed to align yourself with Archie. They constantly undercut his shitty ideas, his ignorance, his behaviors. So you're supposed to watch that. It should radicalize your behavior. Meaning, if you are like my dad and you're watching Archie, you should notice, like, oh, wait, I shouldn't, he's kind of an asshole. Like, I shouldn't be like that. I should, maybe radicalize isn't the right word, but I should be changing the way I see this stuff, right? So, um, I think I think Tyler mentioned that idea of Archie being constantly sort of put in his place. Like he doesn't know it. He's too narcissistic and in his head and ignorant to realize when he's being just eviscerated, right? But everybody at every turn is like, you're wrong. Like this is just stupid. They're laughing at him in many cases. Like he's to be made an example of, right? It's kind of like how people like Michael Scott is sort of a new age version of Archie Bunker. Like you're supposed to watch him and be like, I don't want to be like him, but so many people watch and they love him, right? Like everyone in the office knows that he's an idiot and all this, and he doesn't. And here's Archie, same. Um, and he's constantly sort of having this back and forth with almost every character. Like nobody's in his corner. Even Edith does it once in a while just because she's his wife and that's her role. But nobody's really in his corner ever. Um, and that's quite telling. Um, I think. Um, so yeah, I just mentioned this. Archie's the dying breed. Like that type of person has to become more and more rare and die out for this to work. And with the community sort of rallying against him, maybe we can make it happen. He's being made an example of, even in this episode. Like everybody, no, and nobody gets fired up about it, right? Like there's a lot of heated discussions, but like Henry's like, I know you're ignorant. Like there's nothing I can do about that. But all I can do is, be smarter than you and work harder than you and go about my life. I can't consume myself with people like you trying to bring me down. Everyone seems to have moved on except Archie. Um, and everybody, I think, realizes like he's gonna die out before, we will, I guess. Um, they also bring in some of the stuff is so eerily like prophetic, the way they talk about women and versus black people and the struggles, and talking about black president, women president. Like that was like the last election, the last two elections or whatever have been that, like literally. Um, and they draw a lot of comparisons between those two. Tyler brought that up, like bringing up, um, you know, the women's side of the civil rights movement and what that meant. Let's not forget, right? The way he treats Edith is very traditional, right? It's very Project 25. Uh, so there's all this, um, there's all that stuff going on too. I mean, I can't stress how big a deal Archie Bunker was. Like that chair that he sits in is in the Smithsonian, like as like a monument to racism. I don't I don't know. It was just that it was iconic. Like that show, that character, that whole thing was iconic. But what you miss, you also realize that George Jefferson comes over, Henry's brother. He comes over, and he's just as racist as Archie, right? Like he's nowhere near Henry in terms of like acceptance and like really trying to move forward from the past and do it in a constructive way. Um, he won't have it either. George won't have it. Like nobody's gonna step in my house. No whitey's gonna step in my house. Like that, all that kind of stuff. Um, but he even seems a little bit more, um, a little bit less sort of angry about all of it. But that's the George Jefferson that spun off into the Jeffersons. They lived in Queens, right next door, right? Then they moved on up to the east side to a deluxe apartment in the sky. This is their theme song. Um, from the theme song. So he also moved out of Queens to a way better place. They had a bunch of dry cleaning stores, and Archie can't wrap his head around that. Like, wait, Archie's only understanding of the world is like basically diminutive stereotypes. Like that's it. So if you don't fit into the box of the stereotype, he doesn't know what to make of you. He thinks he can't trust it. Like it can't be real, but it's real. And just, I think everybody needs to see All in the Family and Boondocks, both. I think what happens is every week, I don't, like with All in the Family, every week this was in your house every week. And like I said, everybody watched the show. So they were getting it, exposure to it. Um, and we talked about that. Someone brought that up. Um, how, and I mentioned it earlier, um, just being exposed to these kinds of conversations is probably is a good thing and should happen more. And comedy does that best, I think. Shay also mentioned Henry's portrayal in the show, which was a good point, right? He's not the angry black man. George is a little bit, but certainly um, not to some ridiculous extent. But Henry is very calm. He realizes who Archie is. So Archie's almost not to be taken seriously. Like I think that's what he's not harmless. I wouldn't say he's harmless, but you can't let him affect your day, right? Like that kind of ignorance is just that. It's ignorance. Like, and he's never gonna change. So why spend your time or waste your time trying to make it so? Um, so Henry gives him some stuff to think about. He's like, I'm good, right? So yeah, his portrayal, and even what's Lionel? Lionel is George Jefferson's kid. He comes over and same thing. Like Archie slams him with some racist remark, and he's just like playing along and makes a joke about it, and actually probably makes Archie feel pretty bad about it at the end of the day. So anyway, that's those two shows. Hope you guys are doing well. I'll be in touch with paper stuff. Final paper stuff next week. So heads up.